Hi. While I'm prepping dinner, I'm going to talk about one of the things that just really gets my goat. And that's the abortion lobby's response, abortion lobby and abortion businesses' response when there's malpractice and a woman dies. Okay? Now, supposedly the whole idea of legalizing abortion was to protect women's lives. That if abortion was legal, then they wouldn't be going to quacks anymore, and they wouldn't be dying these horrible deaths. So that was supposedly the justification for legalizing something that a lot of people who, even though they want it legal, the reason they want it legal isn't because they think abortion per se is some kind of good thing, but because they believe that the alternative is, women dying a horrible quackery death. But then you look at what happens when there is quackery in a legal abortion and a woman winds up dead. And there's usually one of three reactions. Okay? The number one reaction that the abortion lobby has is to just say nothing. Okay? Which I think is really irresponsible, because they're the ones that say that they want abortion to be available so that it is safe. And seems to me that they then have a responsibility for alerting women if a place is not safe. So that ticks me off. So usually they just lay low, wait for it to blow over, and say nothing. Another response is the old, well, yes, it's tragic, but abortion is ever so safe. And first of all, the numbers that they use to claim that abortion is ever so safe are bogus. Now, I think the abortion lobby knows about this. I think the people who are practicing abortion know. I think the people that are advocating know. But I think that they're really good at keeping this from everybody else. And the truth is, we do not know how many women die from the safe, legal kind of abortion. We have no idea. Because the method they have of collecting that information is pretty much, they hope that it shows up on a death certificate, goes through the National Center for Health Statistics, and gets to the CDC. And, they said they'll take it and somebody might report it, but nobody's really required to report it. And if you look at the ICD codes, International Classification of Diseases, which they also code accidents and homicide and sucked into jet engine, I mean, you name it, including medical mishaps. The hierarchy for how things get coded hides abortion, so it's really tricky for it to show up on a death certificate. And also, it's really easy to just not bother to put it on a death certificate. Or put it on a death certificate in a place where the computer's not going to pick up on it, and her death will get blamed on something else. So, even if all of the abortion deaths, the death certificate was filled out in such a way that the abortion would show up on the computers and the CDC would get notified. Also, the states do not send all death certificates. They only send samples. Now, for most causes of death, what they do is they extrapolate. So, say California sends 10% of their death certificates to the NCHS to be analyzed, okay? So they will do some data work to figure out, okay, if out of this 10%, so many of them died from emphysema or cancer or diabetes or whatever, then how does that translate to the entire population? But with abortion, they just count that specific death. They don't say, okay, we got one death certificate with an abortion, so it's a pretty good guess that since they sent us 10% of the death certificates, that we know about 10% of the abortion deaths, therefore there's 10 abortion deaths. So what they're doing is the equivalent of putting a bushel basket under an apple tree, counting the apples that fall into that basket, and then asserting that those are all the apples that fell off that tree. And the other thing is they are not very diligent. Operation Rescue is pretty diligent. I'm pretty diligent. A lot of pro-lifers are diligent about spotting and reporting abortion deaths. Not so with the Centers for Disease Control. And a case in point was a young woman who died in Texas in 1991. She bled to death. Now, the family hired Racehorse Haynes, this very flamboyant lawyer, to handle the malpractice case against Dr. Robert Crest, who, very high profile, and he's the guy who did the abortion. And the local news in Texas covered it, but Chris' base of operations was in Missouri, where he had had another dead patient, a mentally disabled rape victim. He gave her medication that reacted, that he should have known would react with the medication that she was already taking due to her existing health problems. Gave her medications that reacted with that, and that killed her. So because he'd already had this patient death, the Missouri papers picked up on it. So then also the pro-lifers picked up on it because they're seeing it in the newspaper. And pretty much every pro-life newspaper and newsletter in the country had picked up on this, from National Right to Life News to Feminists for Life, little local pro-life groups. They're all noting that this 17-year-old girl bled to death after this botched abortion. And all about the lawsuit, about her brother-in-law desperately performing CPR on her while they're waiting for the ambulance. And Chris' lawyers just called it a publicity stunt. So there was already information all over the place about it. And then at the National Abortion Federation Risk Management Seminar the next year, 1992, that was in Dallas, two representatives of the Centers for Disease Control abortion surveillance activities were there, Lisa Coonan and Stanley Henshaw. Now, Lisa Coonan is an especially interesting one because she's somebody whose job it was to verify abortion deaths. I did this research when we were working on Lyme 5. I talked to Clarice Green, who was their research fellow, and she basically said, they get death certificates from the National Center for Health Statistics. Other things get reported. They don't get death certificates. They get the raw data from the National Center for Health Statistics, and then it was Clarice's job to get the death certificate and any related paperwork, any documentation she could find relevant to the death. And she would hand that off to Lisa Coonan, who also worked for Planned Parenthood's Alan Guttmacher Institute. Isn't that interesting? No conflict of interest there. So she would hand them off to Lisa Coonan, and then Lisa Coonan would, quote, verify them. And Clarice never explained to me what verifying is, and I get the feeling that Clarice might not have known what verifying them was. So at any rate, finding out about abortion deaths was part of Lisa Coonan's job. So Lisa Coonan's here at this risk management seminar, and Chris talked about last year, I had a patient, now he blamed it on an amniotic fluid embolism and not just routine hemorrhage, but he was clearly talking about the same teenage girl because it was a 17-year-old, and typically even from an embolism you start to develop clotting problems and you'll bleed to death. So it's pretty obvious that he was talking about this girl at this seminar attended by two CDC people, including the person whose job it is to identify abortion deaths. And when I was at Life Dynamics, we got a report from the CDC. We requested a data run, and they would break the abortion deaths down by age group, like 15 to 19, 20 to 24. They would break it down by race and age group. And there were no deaths they counted for 1991 for Latachi's race and age group. So here it is. Her death was being shouted from the rooftops, talked about in front of CDC employees at this seminar. It could not have been any more obvious to them if this girl had crawled to Atlanta and died on the floor in Lisa Coonan's office with her aftercare instructions clutched in her hand. And they still counted 0 abortion deaths among patients of her race and age group. So clearly they are not exactly falling all over themselves in an effort to find these abortion deaths. But they go ahead and they publish numbers as though they're accurate, which basically is a bald-faced lie. So, at any rate, what the abortion clinics, abortion rights group will do, they'll, when there's a malpractice case and a woman dies, they'll go, yes, oh, this is very sad, but remember, abortion is ever so safe. And, first of all, that's not relevant. We're talking about what happened to this specific woman. And if she's dead, it's 100%. And if she's dead because somebody lacerated her uterus and then just pushed her out of the clinic in a wheelchair, stuck her in the backseat of her mother's car and sent her home to bleed to death, they should still be addressing that. Now, occasionally, when things are really hideous, like with the Kermit Gosnell case, they'll pretend that they are just as appalled as anybody else at how bad this place was and call the person a rogue or an outlier. Well, Abu Hyatt in New York, he made a lot of press. I think it was around 1993. I can't remember exactly. He started an abortion on a woman who turned out to be around 32 weeks pregnant. Reached in with forceps to pull out a chunk of baby, and he managed to pull out an arm, but he evidently realized that this baby was a lot tougher than he expected because she was a lot older. So he sent the mother home, telling her, come back tomorrow. Do not call anybody else or go to a hospital if you have any pain or problems. Just call us. Well, she was having a lot of pain because she went into labor. She tried to call Hyatt's clinic, couldn't get an answer. So she wound up going to the hospital and giving birth to a little girl who was missing her right arm at the shoulder. An obvious dismemberment injury. And the doctors even were really careful. They did all kinds of ultrasounds of the mother's uterus. They looked, is this arm in there someplace? And it wasn't. So that made a big splash. And then women started coming out of the woodwork reporting that, yeah, they'd had abortions from this guy and he'd botched them. Women had been sexually abused by this guy. And a teenage girl had died after an abortion. Now, the press went ahead and uncritically printed about how this guy was, you know, this discreditable rogue, this loner, this guy who was not a part of normal abortion practice, but he was a member of the National Abortion Federation, okay? But they still give the, oh, you know, he's not one of the reputable abortion providers. You know, we would never do a thing like that. And that's what they did with Gosnell as well. Well, he's this rogue, he's this outlier. He worked one day a week at a National Abortion Federation clinic. He was getting referrals from all kinds of reputable clinics that didn't want to do these illegal third trimester abortions, or some of them just weren't comfortable going like past 12 weeks or something like that. So they were referring to this guy. So if you have him working at your clinic one day a week, and you're referring to him, that's not an outlier. In fact, if he's working at your clinic, he's an employee, not an outlier. But the media is totally uncritical. They will publish oh, he was an outlier. That would never happen at a reputable clinic, completely ignoring the fact that women would go into this reputable National Abortion Federation clinic in Delaware, which would collect their money, do their paperwork, and hand them off to Gosnell, who would start their illegal third trimester abortions there, and then finish them up in his house of horrors in Philadelphia, where they would be doped within inches of their lives by untrained staff, and then left to moan on blood-stained recliners amid the fleas and the cat feces. Okay? And they were giving him patients. The mother of baby boy A, that's the path she followed. She went to that reputable National Abortion Federation clinic. They handed her off to Gosnell. It ended in the murder of her baby, who was 30 or 32 weeks old, certainly old enough to survive outside the womb. And the National Abortion Federation pulled the outlier card, and the media published that completely uncritically, when it was right there multiple times in the grand jury report, if anybody had bothered to read it. Okay? So they'll do that. But the other thing they do that is really, really super disgusting is they will defend the guy. And I'm not quite sure how they choose who they're going to defend and who they're going to bitch slap or throw under the bus. I mean, they threw Hyatt under the bus, even though he was a NAF member, because of the ripping the arm off the 32-week baby. I don't think the dead teenager would have been enough, but certainly the sexual abuse of patients. So I'm guessing the combination of dirty clinic, sexual abuse of patients, and Phil Donahue having this maimed baby on his show, you know, they weren't going to touch him with a 10-foot pole. But there was a case in California, Bruce Steer. Now, it's really important to put this in context, because prior to what I'm going to talk about, I heard a discussion at a National Abortion Federation risk management seminar. I listened to years and years and years of tapes of these seminars. During the discussion period, one doctor said that when he pulled bowel, which is when you're doing a second trimester abortion, you're reaching in with forceps and you're twisting off pieces of baby. And this is difficult. You're reaching in and pulling them off. Think about, you know, wrenching the drumstick off a roast chicken. And sometimes they actually poke the forceps through the back of the uterus, grab, pull, and they look and it's a loop of the woman's intestine. Okay, this pulling bowel, known complication. This guy said he'd just kind of poke it back through the hole, give her extra medication to make her uterus clamp down harder, watch her a little bit more carefully in recovery, and then send her home none the wiser. And the moderator, who was Michael Burnhill of the Alan Guttmacher Institute, reamed this guy out. You're going to kill somebody that way. He reviewed what's the proper way to deal with pulled bowel. And then after he'd done that, he's like, how many of you do this? And he still counted 6 people who raised their hands. So, you know, evidently this pulling bowel isn't a big thing, which might explain why when Bruce Steer performed an abortion on a woman named Sharon, his assistant said that he said, I think I pulled bowel. Okay? He left the clinic while Sharon was still in recovery, still bleeding heavily. She was hemorrhaging. She was ashen. He was gone. His staff loaded her into a wheelchair because she was too weak to walk, pushed her out to her mother's car, loaded her up in the car, and she bled to death on the way home. And that was pretty egregious, and the state decided they were going to prosecute him, I believe, for manslaughter. And what happens? What was the response of abortion rights groups? To lobby in his favor, to rally around him to start a legal defense fund for this guy. And he already had a history of quackery, lawsuits up the wazoo. So I have no idea why they decided they were going to defend him. Check my potato water. Some other people they defended. Benjamin Munson in South Dakota. Now, he had been an illegal abortionist, so he was a stalwart pioneer who helped women from the beginning. And after legalization, he chugged right along, and he killed 2 patients. with sloppiness. He left major chunks of fetus in them. You pull off an arm and a leg, you got to know there's more fetus in there, as the prosecutor said. Sent her home. He beat the rap both times, even though clearly he performed what he had to have known were incomplete abortions, sent these women home to die. During the trial, pro-choicers were gathering around. Oh, Ben Munson helps women. Ben Munson is a hero. And when he died, he got this glowing obituary about what a great guy he was. And Linda and Yvonne were completely forgotten. They counted for absolutely nothing. Mylon Vooch in D.C., he had challenged the D.C. abortion law, deliberately getting arrested to challenge it. And he succeeded. And so he became a hero. And after legalization, he got sloppy. 2 dead patients because of clear, unmitigated malpractice. And a reporter even won a prestigious award for doing an investigation of how nasty Vooch's facility was. And when he died, he was praised to the sky. And Wilma and Jeannie, never mind, who cares about them? Harvey Carman. Now, he had just been an illegal abortionist, and in 1954, I believe, performed an illegal abortion on a woman named Joyce in a motel room with a nutcracker. I have yet to figure out how he managed to do that. She died. He was prosecuted because abortion deaths were murder. He went to jail when Jerry Brown was elected governor. He pardoned a guy, turned him loose. And that's the guy who did the Mother's Day Massacre with Gosnell in Philadelphia, where he put those balls of sharp springs into women's uteruses so that they would open up. Basically, it's the way some polar natives, one of the ways to hunt and kill a polar bear is they will take sharp bits of flexible bone, like rib bone, and they'll warm it in their mouths and wad it up real tight, and then they'll wrap blubber around it, and when they take it out of their mouths, it's so cold that it freezes. And they'll leave those, and the polar bears will eat them. Their body heat melts the blubber, and poing, this springs open, and it rips up their innards. And this was basically what supercoils were. Okay, so this is what Harvey Carman was up to. He did this in Philadelphia, and he did a batch in Bangladesh where he augmented it with balsa wood. Plastic springs and balsa wood, that's model airplane parts. That's not medical instruments. But when he died, he got all this praise about what a stalwart promoter of reproductive rights he was. So, this whole thing, I know that your average pro-choice person on the street is typically very uncomfortable with abortion. They don't like the idea, but they're convinced that they have to support the abortion lobby because the abortion lobby is the people protecting women from dying of quackery. And remember, these are the people who are defending people who kill women.